At the end of the last episode, I said the numbers on male loneliness weren't comfortable. Well, they aren't, but they are important. And this conversation is one that most men aren't having with anyone. In this episode, I'm talking about loneliness, and specifically why so many men are lonely, what it's actually doing to their health, and what, practically, can be done about it. Now, it may not be a comfortable episode for many men because it covers territory that many would rather not examine, and that the culture that's formed around men has consistently failed to take seriously enough. But the evidence is clear, and the consequences are serious, and the conversation's worth having, even if, especially if, it's one you haven't had before. Okay, let's get into it. Right, first some numbers. Did you know that in 2023, the United States Surgeon General did something that Surgeon Generals don't often do? He issued what's known as a formal public health advisory, and that's the kind of thing normally reserved for things like tobacco, opioids, infectious diseases. But this particular one was about loneliness. Not as a social trend worth monitoring, but as a public health crisis, with mortality consequences comparable to smoking. The advisory noted that loneliness increases the risk of premature death by 26%, cardiovascular disease by 29%, and dementia by 50%. Isn't that staggering? A 50% increased risk of dementia from loneliness. Now, previously, a 2021 survey in the US found that 15% of men reported having no close friends, and that was up from 3% in 1990. In other words, a five-fold increase in just 30 years. In the UK, where I live, 1 in 5 men claims to have no close friends at all, and in the UK, men account for approximately 3/4 of all suicides. Now, the numbers are connected. They're not separate stats about separate problems. They are different measurements of the same thing. Let's look at why male loneliness is different. Loneliness is the experience of a gap between the social connection that you have and the social connection that you really need. And it's worth distinguishing from about being alone. Being alone is a circumstance, because many people are alone without being lonely, and many people are lonely, but in the middle of apparently full social lives. Male loneliness tends to have a particular character that distinguishes it from female loneliness in ways that are relevant to understanding both its causes and its consequences. Men's social networks, for example, they tend to be broader and shallower than women's. Men tend to have more acquaintances, but fewer intimate friendships. They have more contacts, but fewer confidants. Men are more likely to have people to do things with, but less likely to have people to really talk to. This means that male loneliness often coexists with an apparent socially active life. The man who's got colleagues, teammates, drinking companions, neighbours, but none of them are people that they would necessarily describe as knowing very well, and they would find it particularly difficult to identify anyone that they could see to if something was genuinely wrong. Now, this distinction between social activity and social intimacy is quite important, because social activity without intimacy doesn't protect against the health consequences of loneliness. The research is specifically about the quality and depth of connection, not its quantity, and by that I mean 100 acquaintances provides considerably less protection than, say, 1 or 2 genuinely close relationships. So, how does it happen? Male loneliness is not primarily the result of some kind of individual failure. It has structural causes. They operate largely independently of individual character or effort. So, telling a man simply to become more sociable will always have a limited effect. Male friendships in youth are largely the product of proximity and shared circumstance. You're at school, you're at university, you're starting your working life. Now, all these institutions do provide a structural condition for friendship. They give you regular contact, you have shared experience, and some kind of enforced proximity, and it's a context that generates some kind of natural conversation, but without anyone needing to make a particular effort. After the scaffolding falls away, in the late 20s and 30s, say, as careers and families tend to absorb more time and energy, then male friendship depends on active maintenance, and most men were never particularly taught to provide that. This results in a gradual, mutual, largely unintentional drift that leaves men in midlife with networks that have contracted to a fraction of their earlier sizes, if not dissipated altogether. Now, the second structural cause is geography. People move. They move for work, for partners, for housing, and the friend that used to live 20 minutes away is now 3 hours or more away. The friendship that ran on regular low-effort contact now requires planning, coordination, and the expense of a train ticket. Now, many don't survive these sorts of transitions, and it's not because of any failure of affection, but simply because the effort becomes too high. The third structural cause, and the one that catches many men completely off guard, is the division of domestic and social labour. In heterosexual partnerships, social life is often managed much more disproportionately by women, and research consistently finds that it's the women who take the lead in arranging social engagements, they maintain the couple's relationships with other couples, and it's them that sustain the social infrastructure of family life. Men in this arrangement participate in a social life that's largely organized by someone else, and this has a particular consequence when partnerships end either through divorce, separation, or bereavement. The man whose social life has been primarily mediated through his partner quickly discovers that without her organizational input, the social network just contracts. The couple friendships were, pretty much to a significant degree, her friendships. His individual network, neglected over years of partnership, has thinned out completely, and it's one of the reasons why bereavement and divorce are particularly associated with male loneliness, and why widowed and divorced men have significantly elevated rates of depression, physical illness, and premature death compared to their female counterparts. Many men discover the extent of their social dependence on their partners only when the partner's no longer there, and it's not a comfortable discovery, and it typically arrives at the worst possible time. The fourth structural cause is using the workplace as some kind of social substitute. For much of adult life, the workplace functions as a primary source of male social connection, in that it provides daily contact, a sense of belonging, shared purpose, and low-stakes conversation that constitutes much of our human experience. Men who are highly work-identified can easily mistake this for a kind of social life, rather than recognizing it as a workplace-specific stimulus. And the problem becomes very apparent at retirement, redundancy, or career transition. Once the workplace disappears, it takes the social provision with it. The colleagues, who once appeared to be like friends, turn out, in the absence of that shared context, just to be contextual acquaintances. The social life was the job, and the job's gone. So the structural explanation accounts for much of male loneliness, but not all of it. There are, of course, psychological factors, and they compound the structural ones and are, in many respects, more amenable to change, so that's positive. Let's take on what we call the vulnerability problem. Close friendship, and by that I mean the kind that provides genuine social support and protects against health consequences of loneliness, always requires a degree of mutual vulnerability. You have to reveal something about yourself. You have to allow someone to know you in a way that includes your difficulties, your uncertainties, and your failure to have everything under control. For men socialized to associate vulnerability with weakness, it can be a significant barrier. And what we end up with is a result of a friendship that plateaus at a kind of level of comfortable superficiality. It's pleasant, it's functional, but really it's insufficient. In other words, you've got company, but not intimacy, and you may have activity, but no support's there. So when something genuinely difficult happens, a health scare, a relationship crisis, a bereavement, these types of friendships are just not equipped to carry that kind of heavy load. Now, the next is what I call an asking problem. Initiating and maintaining social contact always requires some kind of social initiative that many men find uncomfortable. It's not because they lack the social skills, it's simply because the cultural script for male friendship involves connection by simply being present rather than being actively sought. So, calling a friend to suggest a specific meeting, expressing that you value someone's company, and making the explicit effort to stay in touch is more problematic than it sounds. And they're problematic because they feel to many men like some kind of neediness, and it conflicts with their self-sufficient presentation, the one that they've spent years constructing. So the practical consequence is that many men are lonely not because nobody would respond to some kind of overture they're prepared to make, but simply because they just haven't made one, and it because making one feels like something they'd just rather not reveal. The third, I suppose, is a recognition problem. Men are much less likely to identify their own experiences as loneliness. Women will, in similar circumstances, admit more. The word loneliness carries connotations. It smacks of failure, undesirability, of being the kind of person who just can't manage their own social life. And these are things that men are particularly resistant to applying to themselves. It means that male loneliness frequently goes unnamed. Unnamed experiences are considerably harder to address than named ones. The man who recognizes that he's lonely can, at least in principle, do something about it. The man who experiences the symptoms of loneliness, the flatness, the disconnection, that vague sense of dissatisfaction, without connecting them to their cause, is much more likely to address them in ways that don't work. It's a bit like depression. You work harder, you drink more, you stay busier. Now, the health consequences of loneliness are serious enough to warrant more than just a passing mention. At a neurological level, loneliness produces a state of chronic threat arousal. The brain treats social isolation as a survival risk, which, for most of human evolutionary history, it was. Elevated cortisol, increased inflammatory signaling, a heightened vigilance for social threat. This state, when sustained, produces exactly the same physiological consequences as chronic stress: cardiovascular damage, immune suppression, metabolic disruption, and cognitive decline. Now, the Holt-Lundstad analysis is one of the most comprehensive analyses of the relationship between social connection and mortality. It's the one that found that social isolation was associated with a 29% increase in mortality risk. Now that is equivalent to something like 15 cigarettes a day, and it exceeds the mortality rate associated with chronic obesity. At a psychological level, therefore, Loneliness produces and maintains depression, anxiety, it impairs sleep, it reduces cognitive function, and it generates the kind of negative social cognition like the hypervigilance to rejection, the negative interpretation of ambiguous social signals that makes social engagement needed to address it feel increasingly threatening. Loneliness makes itself harder to fix the longer it persists, which is, quite frankly, one of the crueler features of the condition. So, what do we know that helps? Well, the research on addressing loneliness in men points fairly consistently in a couple of directions. The first is activity-based connection. Now, the side-by-side model of male friendship, in which men connect through some kind of shared activity and shared attention, rather than that face-to-face emotional disclosure model, is the thing that seems to work best for most men. Working with it is much more effective than trying to replace it. Sport, hobby groups, walking clubs, community activities that provide regular structured contact but without requiring the explicit cultivation of friendship are the things that work. The connection emerges from the activity rather than being its declared aim, and it's considerably less threatening than social engagement for its own sake. The second is a bit of a tongue twister because it's called men's sheds. Men's sheds are community workshops, and they're organised around practical activities, and they create structural conditions for male friendship to develop. In the UK, there are over 700 of them, and their own website has got a locator near you. The research on their impact on loneliness, depression and well-being is some of the most positive in the field. The third is Parkrun. Free, weekly, social physically accessible to most men, and with a community around it that's been shown to produce genuine social connection among regular participants. The Parkrun website has got a locator for events across the UK. The fourth, and this is probably the most underused, is making contact. The research on reconnection consistently finds that both parties benefit and that the awkwardness of reinitiating contact is substantially lower in reality than in anticipation, so the barrier is psychological rather than practical. Send the message, suggest the arrangement, say directly that you'd like to see someone. Loneliness that's severe, prolonged, and accompanied by depression, hopelessness, or thoughts of self-harm always warrants professional support. The resources page on my website, drjerrykennard.com, lists of support that's available in both the UK and the US. Male loneliness isn't inevitable. It's the product of structural conditions that can be changed, and psychological habits that can be revised, and cultural expectations that actually are already, if rather slowly, shifting. The fact that it's reached epidemic proportions isn't evidence that it's the natural state of men. It's evidence that something's gone wrong, and the response has been inadequate. Men listening to this who recognise themselves in it, who've been aware of a certain thinning in their social world without quite naming it, aren't failures. They're experiencing an entirely predictable consequence of living in a culture that dismantles the structure of male social connection without providing alternatives. And that treats the resulting loneliness as a personal inadequacy rather than a structural problem. The framing's wrong. Acting as though it's wrong, making contact, seeking connection, building the social infrastructure that doesn't appear on its own is both more possible and much more urgent than most men have been led to believe. I think that probably the most important thing I can leave you with from this episode is this. Think of the list of people you'd call if something went seriously wrong. Not the colleagues or the neighbours, the people you'd actually call. How many are there? When did you last speak to them? When did you last see them in person? If that list is shorter than you'd like, and the contact less recent than you expected, well, it's useful information. It's not necessarily cause for alarm, but it may be cause for action. The investment required is really quite modest, just a message or a suggestion. The returns, measured in health and resilience, and in the simple quality of having people you know, are disproportionate to the investment in a way that almost nothing else available on a Thursday evening can match. The full article for this episode is at drjerrykennard.com in the relationship section. Everything on the site's free to read, and there's no intrusive ads. Next episode? Well, we're going to somewhere that directly covers everything that we've touched on in this episode and the last. And I'm talking about sleep, what it does, what happens when it goes wrong, and why the thing that most men do to help themselves sleep is probably making everything considerably more worse. If you've been tired for longer than seems reasonable, well, that's the episode for you. Until then, take care of yourself, and maybe consider picking up the phone. I'm Jerry Kennard. You've been listening to The Quiet Midlife.